You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, welcome to Indications. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot, Senior Economist at the Conference Board. You're listening to the U.S. Labor Market Roundup, our monthly podcast series where we break down the monthly U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs report and identify key trends in the U.S. job market that business leaders should know about. Today, I'll be discussing the December jobs report with my two regular guests and labor market experts. Gad Levanon, head of our Labor Markets Institute and a regular contributor in Forbes, and Frank Steemers, senior economist at the Conference Board, focusing on U.S. and global labor markets. Gad and Frank, thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Okay, let's get right to it then. So finally, the slowing momentum in the number of job gains that we've seen month to month since last summer has given way to job losses. U.S. employers shed 140,000 jobs in December, and the unemployment rate stayed steady at 6.7%. As disappointing as it is, it's not much of a surprise as a second wave of COVID-19 cases and rising business restrictions hit the U.S. economy hard in December. The job losses were primarily driven by one industry, food services and drinking places, which alone lost almost 375,000 jobs. We did see some strong job gains outside of bars and restaurants, such as in retail trade, professional and business services, and construction, but not enough to offset the weakness in the food services industry, which is highly sensitive to the trajectory of the pandemic. While the unemployment rate had held steady at 6.7%, overall, for the first time since April, it ticked up for whites and women. And for Hispanics, unemployment increased nearly a full percentage point to 9.3%. On the plus side, the unemployment rate fell pretty substantially for Asians to 5.9% and for Blacks to 9.9%. And this is the first time Black unemployment hit single digits since the beginning of the crisis. Labor force participation also remained steady overall, but increased for whites while falling for Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. So fewer minorities are out there either working or looking for work. Finally, the number of persons on temporary layoffs surged, reflecting the uncertainty that many employers find themselves in right now, not being able to sustain their current payroll, but also not wanting to fully cut ties with employees as vaccination campaigns ramp up and they finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. So with that set up, let's go ahead and turn to our labor market experts. Gad, let me start with you. We know that the U.S. labor market reacts to larger trends in the overall economy. What is the brief outlook on the U.S. economy and what is likely to happen in the coming months?
Sure. So I think the outlook, the economic outlook is very much depends on what's happening to the virus. And unfortunately, there we have pretty bad news. The virus is spreading, as we all know, and that is leading to two things. One, people are more afraid to go out and about and spend, and also governments are forcing more restrictive policies in terms of what can be opened, what cannot be opened, travel bans, quarantine when you move across states and things like that. The restrictions, on average, the U.S. became more restrictive during November and stayed at an elevated level of restrictiveness. And that is already impacting spending, especially consumer spending. We know that, for example, food services and drinking places, already in November, was down by 4% in a month. And as you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, it also was reflected in employment number for December. Other parts of leisure and hospitality and accommodations are also suffering. So that, those in-person services that are related to social distancing are suffering and will continue to suffer. If Europe is any guide to what will happen in the winter in the US, it can only get worse, unfortunately. Having said that, on the positive side, outside of consumption, there are a lot of areas of strength in the U.S. economy. For example, there is a boom in housing, in business investment. There's also a new stimulus that is already impacting and getting to the wallets of Americans. So from that perspective, we should expect most industries and most parts of the economy not to be as impacted, but those in-person services, they're likely to be significantly impacted throughout the winter.
Mm-hmm. And following up on that about the in-person services, we know that those vaccination campaigns are really starting to roll out. What impact is the vaccine going to have on job growth? And when can we expect to see that reflected in the labor market?
Yeah, so, I think, as we all know, the rollout campaign was not it was not as great as we hoped for, but the U.S. is a large ship. It takes time to turn it around, but when you finally turn it around, it's moving fast. And I think in recent the recent weeks there has been an improvement. Some forecasters predict that we will reach herd immunity by late summer, but even before that, the number of new cases is likely to reach minimal levels already in late spring, early summer. So I think at that point, people will feel much more willing to go out and about and spend. And we'll see, starting in the second quarter, then in the second half of the year, we'll see a pretty strong recovery in the economy and in the labor market, partly because those in-person services industries are very labor intensive. There are a lot, millions and millions of workers in those industries, and many of them will make a comeback. We expect that by the first quarter of 2022, there will be 4 to 5 million jobs created by then, and the unemployment rate will go below 5%. So the year will start with a whimper, but end with a bang.
Now, that's a really optimistic outlook. And, you're talking about seeing sort of that impact of the vaccine not until later in the first quarter, even into the second into the second quarter or even into the second half of the year. Frank, when we're talking more about, what's going to happen now, more in the near term, how is the trajectory of the pandemic playing out in the labor market? And specifically, how was it reflected in the December's job numbers?
Right. I think the most important insight from the latest jobs report, and I think both of you have already talked about it a little bit, and that is that, yes, we had a decline in employment, but it was really only visible in leisure and hospitality. In most other industries, it continued to grow. So I think that it's interesting to see, because in March and April, the in-person services were also by far the most impacted. And that in these months, we also saw big employment losses across all industries. But you can see that over the last months, businesses have gotten more used to continue to do business while the virus starts to spread maybe more rapidly. They now know better how they can continue. And I think that is what we're seeing, that working remotely is at this point nothing new anymore. So I think that we should expect that when the virus continues to rapidly spread, of course, it means that will hamper employment growth. But at the same time, it will not be as bad anymore as we have seen in the beginning of this crisis. So I think if we also look forward, I think indeed, and Ged, you also talked about it, the unemployment rate at some point will also start to go down again. I think what I'm really wondering is if we will be fully vaccinated, say in the second half or maybe in 2022, will workers that dropped out of the labor force after February, will all of these workers have returned to the labor force, or will they not? And I think that is a very big question, and that might also indicate how successful the labor market will recover going forward from here, because it will be very difficult to bring all of these workers back into the labor market again.
Yeah, especially when we think about long-term unemployment. There are some workers that haven't been working since last February. So the longer that they are unemployed, the more difficult it is for them to jump back into that labor market. So I think that question you pose is really critical in the overall recovery of this labor market. So I think that's where we're going to end things for today. I've been speaking with Gad Lebanon and Frank Steemers about the main insights from the December jobs report. Gad and Frank, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening. Please join us for the next U.S. Labor Markets Roundup, where we'll be discussing the first jobs report of the new year. Don't forget to subscribe to Indications and other podcast series from the Conference Board through your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for listening. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot with the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.